editorial page editor, Josh Brodesky.
Hey there, everyone. Thanks again for joining us for another live Ed Board meeting. Today, we're very lucky we're joined by Christine Drennon, who's a sociology and anthropology professor at Trinity University. Also here are other editorial board members, Gloria Padilla and Carrie Clack. And the topic today really is about addressing inequalities in San Antonio. The editorial board, we are in the midst of a project about addressing inequalities in San Antonio. So this is very much part of our traditional reporting process. And now that we're in this world of Zoom and live streams, we figured we can show you the interviews that we're doing, and it's helpful to the community. So Christine, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
It's great to have you. So just to kick it off, mostly we're going to be looking at education, inequalities in education, and we're really interested in historical forces that have shaped those inequalities, but also present day forces. But social pressures, property taxes, anything that would contribute to the inequalities that we all live in and participate in. But I think just to kick things off, I'm actually gonna ask you a question, not about education, but about that iconic food bank photo that we all saw, I think in April, where we saw thousands and thousands of vehicles lined up. And I think that was a moment, both locally and nationally, where a lot of attention was brought to poverty and inequality in San Antonio and the immense need that was out there. But I was just curious, when you saw that image, what did you think? How did you react to it? What did you read into it?
I think about it, that image continues to haunt, doesn't it? I mean, we continue to think about it every day with the news and how the current crisis is impacting people very differently. It comes back to that image. And the interesting thing about that image is that we know that, right? There was statistics that came out, I think it was just this spring, and we have the highest percentage of people of all the big cities that live under the federal poverty line. And we know it, we talk about it, but the image was so startling because we never see it, right? Not only are we poor, but we're economically segregated, which makes us also racially segregated. But we never see it and we never experience it. Right? And when I say we, I have to speak, I am speaking from a personal perspective, right? White middle class. But our city is such and our geography is such that we don't encounter, except sometimes through the newspaper or through media, we don't encounter that kind of difference. And so when we see a picture of it, it's so startling, and I call it haunting because it continues to come back. Right? Where is that? What is that? Who are people? And then you start to think about it. We're part of a larger community, and so where am I in this? Right? Do I have social responsibility? Responsibility to community? How do I do that? All of those questions came out in that photograph, and then it was national news. And some of our social statistics have been national news before. Our economic segregation has been national news, and it's things that as we take the city on the road, which obviously we're not doing right now, but our visitor tourists, our economic development corporations and parts of the city do that all the time. They take the city on the road, and those are not things that they want everybody to know about, right? Would you want to move your young family as first job out of college or second job out of college to the most economically segregated city in the country? No. And so we need to think really deeply about that, and actually we need to be shown more images like that, like, wow, here, face this. This is us.
Yeah, I think one thing that really struck me about that image, was at the time Eric Cooper was saying that we were serving, the food bank was serving 120,000 people a week, but in normal times it was 60,000 people a week, which is itself untenable. And I guess sort of drifting into the topic about education and inequality, what role does our current education environment, or by environment, I mean the number of districts we have, how those districts were shaped, how does that play into the poverty rates that are so endemic in San Antonio and the economic segregation that we see? And I realize that's a huge question and you could write a whole book about it, but that's my clumsy way of shifting into this topic. So.
Getting going. Yeah, so the first thing that we need, first thing when we think about schools, and let me tell you, let me take like a little bit of a diversion. The reason that I came to this question, I'm a geographer by training, and when I moved here 20 years ago, and I moved here to become part of an urban studies program at Trinity, long history, long valuable history to the city. I consider myself a very urban person. I'm from northeastern cities, and like the density, like the age of the inner city, and that's what I looked for. I had 2 little kids at the time, but between myself and my partner, we had like multiple college degrees, and we always thought that we could help our children if they weren't not in the best schools. But we were very much steered, right? We were very much steered by realtors to various parts of town. And we kept hearing about this school district and that school district. And everything was guided by the school districts, right? All decisions were to be guided by school districts. And nobody questioned like, well, what's like a couple of questions. Why so many? And then, well, why is that border there, right? What is that? Why does that street mean so much in the distribution of wealth in this city? Like, what is that, right? So I came to this question through a real personal experience, which I think is why I continue to be driven by it, because it just got me, right, at a gut level. The school district story is a really interesting one, because the whole 8, however you count them, 18, 19 that we have in the county, that's extraordinary. And it's very unique. Other cities don't have that. Houston is kind of an example. They have a ton of school districts, but Houston proper is just about 1, right? LA is 1. It's called LA Consolidated. Chicago, but our city itself is split, right? So that's very different than these other large cities, even big sprawling cities. The other thing is that just through poking around, I came across an old map drawn by the WPA in the late 1930s of the school districts then in Texas. It's this big book. It's like 4 inches thick, full of maps of every county in Texas and their school districts. And at that point, there were 68. And so it immediately like blew open this whole question about like, wow, what is the history? Where does this come from? But school districts, the interesting thing about our school districts is that they're completely coupled with property, right? They're a function of property. And so you have to look beyond just the school districts to the distribution of property across the landscape, right? Where does everybody live? Why do they live there? Why do different neighborhoods look like they do? And that's how the school districts got put together. It was the agglomeration of different developments and properties that forms those school districts. So in that process, right, because when our city was first established, especially at the beginning of the 20th century, it was pure land speculation. It was all big names that we would recognize today, because a lot of our streets are named after the old land speculators, right? And some of these families are still around today, but they would buy up big parcels of land, just like that. What happens today at the edge of town? They would go to the county courthouse. They would subdivide them. They would use a whole bunch of legal tools to figure out who could live in what parts of town, right? Some lots were really big. Some lots were really small. Some lots said, okay, you had to have a house of this big and worth this much in order to live in this neighborhood. And some had no restrictions at all. So what we found is, as you start to piece that together, and I've tried to map this, and it's really interesting maps, is that here I'm sitting at Trinity right now. When this area was developed by someone called J. Adams, he did it on, he bought up all of this ranch land to the north of downtown. He platted it, right, subdivided it, built really big, beautiful houses, said they had to be worth $5,000 or more, and that only white people could live in them. Right? So what he's doing is he's joining wealth and property immediately. Somebody else buys up that land on the west side and subdivides it, and it's all around the stockyards, and it's around the railroads, and it's around the creeks and things like that flood occasionally. And then he subdivides it, and he subdivides it into little tiny parcels of land and puts little tiny houses on it, and sold those houses for $500, not $5,000, $500, and said anybody can live here, right? And so what we did really early in our history was we racialized wealth. It's already racialized, but that's where we institutionalize it. We said, if you're going to live in this neighborhood, this is what it's going to be worth, and this is who gets to live here. This one over here, this is what it's going to be worth, and this who gets to live here. And the city grew up like this. The school districts form in that environment, in this environment of development, right? They were formed in the late 19th century in the 68 districts. But at that time, we had school districts like the Lock Hill Selma district. And a lot of people know where Lock Hill Selma Road is today. It was right up there. And they had like 30 kids in it. These were incredibly rural. Kids would walk to school, and then eventually you see buses come into the story. But, and sometimes the school would be open and sometimes it would be closed. They were very, very rural. As the city began to grow, there's a consolidation movement, and it begins on the East Coast, and it was called Taylorism, right? It's a movement that comes out of the private sector with industrialism, and especially in car manufacturing and in the fiber textile industries. They realized like they need to be more efficient in industry, and they need to probably really look at their management and how they divvy out tasks, and especially with the adoption and implementation of things like assembly lines. You don't have all these bodies moving around all the time. Now the human body stays still, and we move the product, right? So there's all of these innovations in industry that passes into local governments, and local governments start to think about, well, how should we be more efficient? Ultimately, that movement on the East Coast in the 1920s turns into school district consolidation. Because I realized, like, we shouldn't have 68 school districts. We should only have a couple. We should consolidate so we don't have 60 administrations. We have one or two. They're a little larger, but hopefully they run a little bit more efficiently. We don't have 60 bus fleets. We have one or two, right? That movement doesn't get to Texas until the 1940s and 1950s. I don't know what, we're a little bit behind the times on some things. But we also begin the consolidation process in the 1950s. And all of this, all of these records are still up at the TEA on these. Well, I did this work about 15 years ago. There's these records on like little pieces of paper, like this size. They're all index cards, and they're all handwritten. And they say like all of these 30 different districts.
I'm sorry.
Yep. These 30 different districts are going to consolidate, and they're going to become the North Side School District. And what do you see in the Bexar County minutes, right? In the minutes, because when it was the 68 different districts, they were underneath the county. They did have local administration, but the real decision making was at the county level and under the county judge and commissioner's court. So all these minutes are still with the county. And in the minutes, you see these conversations between the different school district administrations and school district administrators. And they say like, well, how many kids do you have? How many buses do you have? Right? How much property do you have, and how much is your property worth? And then between themselves, probably at little diners, telephones, however they came to these decisions, they said, well, let's consolidate. And about 30 different little districts, no, not 30, maybe 20, come to form Northside. And there's not a lot of kids in there at that point. Same thing with Northeast, same thing with East Central, right? Big kind of our middle class districts today. Same thing's happening in the inner city. Now, San Antonio, the city of San Antonio, the old 6x6 mile square, was always, through state law, was always an independent school district. because it was urban, right? And the urban districts, again, state constitution, they had their own independent school district. And what the independent mean, the ISD meant that it was independent of the county. It had its own, its authority to elect and to raise taxes, and the own authority to spend those taxes how it saw fit, right? So SAISD had that, and then the federal military districts had that as well. During this consolidation process, right? And the point I'm trying to get across is that we've got land development going on in an incredibly racist way, right? Land and wealth coming together and being institutionalized into our landholding in our neighborhoods at the same time that our school districts are coming together. So we have some neighborhoods that are white by law and quite wealthy because that's how they were built. We have other school neighborhoods that are Latino, Mexican American, and at this point it was Mexican and European immigrant, and actually quite poor, because that's who was allowed to live here, and that's the kind of housing that was built. As school district consolidation begins to happen, and they're looking at these property values, some of those decisions start to get made around that. Now, San Antonio at the time is a wealthy district, right? Because San Antonio has neighborhoods like Monte Vista, Tobin Hill, King William, Dignity, right? These are wealthy neighborhoods up until mid-century. Later on, they get redlined in mid-century, but earlier, those are wealthy. That's where our elite lived. Our elites lived in those three areas: Dignity Hill, King William, and Monte Vista. Right? And Monte Vista is even a little further north than that at this point. So San Antonio is a wealthy district. Edgewood, right? Edgewood on the west side is not. Edgewood borders, the west side of the San Antonio School District, and is old agricultural land that's subdivided. And some of it was actually racially restricted, but it was never enforced to the same extent. And you never had those high property values. So it is Mexican American for a very long time. The old farmers weren't. The first urban development is. And Edgewood is going through these pressures also. And Edgewood literally, they get on the phone or whatever, right, with Northside School District, the new Northside, and they said, can we consolidate with you? We're very small, right? And we're growing. We have a lot of kids. And Northside says, well, yeah, you have a lot of kids. But what are you worth? What's your property worth? And Northside said, no, we won't consolidate. Edgewood calls San Antonio ISD, right? And they have the same conversation. And in the Edgewood school minutes, it says San Antonio never returned our call, or they never called back, which to them was a no, right? Edgewood at that point petitions to the state and becomes an independent school district, which is why they're so small. They were one of the old common districts. They consolidated with Stafford. Those old common districts were real small because they were rural. At that point, San Antonio does consolidate. They consolidate with Los Angeles Heights, Los Angeles Heights Common School District. Los Angeles Heights is an old kind of, great, fabulous middle-class San Antonio neighborhood, if you're familiar with it. Just on the kind of northwest corner of the old city. Consolidate with W.W. White to the east. They consolidate with Hotwells to the southeast. That's why it's got such an odd shape. Big square, and then these things appended to it. Funny thing is, San Antonio calls Alamo Heights really old school district also. And they say, you're small, we're large. Do you want to consolidate? It's more efficient. And Alamo Heights says, well, we got things, we're doing well. When we formed, we're an independent city. Our property is worth a lot because it was heavily restricted. Houses in Olmos Park had to be at least $15,000. And then in 1910 and 1900, that was a lot of money. Now they're worth over $1 million. Only white, right? Heavily restricted, even to the point that they're that rock face, beautiful house. And Alamo Heights says to SAISD, nah, we're good. We're good. We've got high property values. We got wealthy families. We don't need consolidation. By the end of the, by really in the 1960s, the state legislature changes some of those laws to make it much more difficult to consolidate. But by then we're down to the 18 districts that we have today. It's not until the 1990s, though, despite the court cases in the 1970s, it's not until the 1990s that we really try to equalize spending across those boundaries. There was some redistribution between the districts, even in those early days, but it's not, we don't try to equalize it until 1992, right, with Senate Bill 7. And that was came out of the series of Edgewood cases that said, listen, like we have all of these school districts and now they're pretty, they're really institutionalized. We are, because our property values are so different, we are so unequal. What are we going to do about it? And is it constitutional? United States or the US Supreme Court says this is not our business. Education is not in our purview, and they send it back to the states. And the state really, because of national embarrassment, said, yeah, we need to do something about it. It took them 20 years to do it. And we have Robin Hood, and Robin Hood equalized, right? When you equalize, and everybody has seen that little schematic at this point, when you equalize over unbelievable inequality, right? House values in the west side of San Antonio and in Edgewood were $500. House values in Almost Park were $15,000. You equalize over that, it just cements it in, right? Now everybody gets like, you know, today it's about $10,000 per kid. If, you know, everybody gets the same amount, then we still maintain the inequality. We've just pushed everybody up a couple $100, and that's all. We did try to address that with Robin Hood. But some of the really interesting things that I have found is that student achievement is much more tightly correlated, and this has statistical significance. Student achievement is much more tightly correlated with wealth in a community, and I measure that by property values, than it is by spending in a school. My fear is that that will not be, like, that'll be misinterpreted to say, oh, well, spending in a school doesn't matter. It matters a lot. It matters a lot. We need as much money as we can on every single child. But what it means to me is that it's also the wealth in the community. It's one of the real predictors of student success, right? And I live in a 1,200 square foot house, not an expensive house. So it's not, you know, it's more about the stability of these communities. Is it the home ownership in these communities, the equity that people built in these communities, and does it provide a social safety net for a family and a stable community for a child to grow up in? And in some of our neighborhoods, we haven't taken care of that. And that's where, and now we're in the face of this extreme poverty, and 120,000 people on one day needing food. That's a start.
You mentioned in your study that you presented to the Geographical Society that when we have too many school districts, you perpetuate this pattern. But how do we go about reversing that when you say that we've had legislation put in place that doesn't allow for us to go back and maybe consolidate some of these districts? Yeah,
and the legislation, we could do it. Now it takes a public referendum, which before it wouldn't, and that would be really, really difficult. So yeah, it's technically legally possible, but really difficult. So school district consolidation comes up a lot, and it's a really interesting question, because would it solve some of the problems? And if we look at a district like Northside, which is this like in the big picture, Northside's a very successful district. And it's large. And what they've done, and Northeast has done it also, is that they've been real strategic and diplomatic about where they put their resources. So they've put a lot of their really great resources in the poorer parts of the lower income. I'm not going to say they're poor. They are lower income than the far northern parts. So John Jay High School, which is in the lower income areas of Northside, has got their great STEM facilities. Lee High School in the lower income parts of Northeast has got their great STEM and their great arts programs in order to try to get folks to move around. And so that was that's that, and we can understand that as a product of consolidation and how do we try to mix people up, and some of those are real success stories. But what they did that's interesting about that is they moved resources, right? And that's what I'm really struck with, is that we don't necessarily when we think about community, I'm backing up for just a little bit. When we think about community and kids, to me, and maybe I'm probably dating myself, but I believe deeply in neighborhood schools, because I believe deeply in community and in neighborhood, right? We're not in this alone. We're not in this as individuals. As individuals, we're very much part of community. And I think that's how we have to raise our kids. So ideally, kids walk to a neighborhood school when they're little, and yep, they take a bus when they go to high school because high schools are bigger. But they are very much a part of a community that they are cognizant of. A lot of thinking these days is we have to mix those things up. But we also know that kids do much better when they're not moved around, right? If the kid can stay in the same school over a number of years, they do better in school. It's really easy peasy statistics. So why don't we move resources, right? Why don't we just move resources? Why don't we take Robin Hood and just totally blow it up? Not on an equality lens, but on an equity lens. Let's say, and we can absolutely safely assume with total confidence that every child has the ability to perform at the level of the best and wealthiest school districts in our state, right? Every child has that ability. But for some reason, they're not realizing that for a whole bunch of reasons. So let's have that as our lens, right? Let's have that kind of like this is our lens. We're going to use whatever resources we can possibly get our hands on to get every child to this level of performance. Not on spending, but on performance, right? We think about this in the health community. We know that we have a health disparity between the inner city. We have census tracts on the west side of town where the lifespan, the average lifespan of an adult is 68 years. 5 miles further northwest, average lifespan is over 80. It's a whole generation different, right? We know that most human bodies are capable of living to 80 to 90 years old. Then that should be our goal, not the average. Our goal should be that. How do we do that? We get the resources to people so that everybody gets there. Can we think of the same thing in education? And I'm not, honestly, I think school district consolidation for some things is absolutely great. Like, let's buy toilet paper together. Let's buy cafeteria food together. But for some things, we need to do the opposite. We need to push decision-making all the way down to the ground, all the way down to the principal level, right? Principals are the leaders. And that is one of the best predictors of how well a school performs and how well and how, and especially with our neighborhood school, is these fantastic leaders that are on the ground. Let's give them our faith and our resources and allow them to do that. School district consolidation, I think, has the threat of possibly taking a little bit of that away of decision making. Where would a lot of decision making lie? So I think, as far, I like to think about the redistribution of resources rather than the redistribution of children.
Do you think the city's equity budget can play a role in this?
Yeah, I think the thinking of it does, right? I love the vocabulary. I love the idea, introduction of the idea. Now it's going to be very hard, but it's even more important. They started with transportation. Okay, yes, I understand why. But if we can move that into human resources, right? Let's move the equity, thinking about equity, this equity lens into human resources, that would be revolutionary, right? And so what does it mean? Well, for a lot of families, and yeah, it would take a lot of thinking and a lot of agreement. A lot of families fulfill, back to the photograph of the first food bank drive during COVID. A lot of families fulfill their needs through the market, right? I'm going to go to the HEB. I'm going to fulfill my need for school, for food. I'm going to go to a daycare and fulfill my need for childcare. I'm going to go to my doctor and fulfill my need for healthcare, right? I'm going to go to the movies and fulfill my need for entertainment. But a lot of families can't do that. It's a whole nother issue as far as our income, right? And because we have never really instituted a living wage, like another really important conversation. But because of that, and because I firmly believe a lot of it's institutionalized in our property and how we racialize wealth through property also, two things that go together. A lot of us cannot fulfill our most basic daily needs through the market, right? And so what happens? In another country, there's revolution. In our country, we have a welfare state, and we're supposed to, and the state is supposed to step in and fulfill those needs. And what are those needs? Those are in healthcare. So that's Medicare and Medicaid. That's in food. That's much more, well, as far as the school lunch program, that's a federal program. Thank God for President Johnson, right? In entertainment, that was PBS, President Johnson, welfare state. It's Social Security, Roosevelt, welfare state. In housing, it's the housing authorities. And that's also welfare state. That's old Roosevelt administration legislation that created that. We're inching away from a lot of that. Public education is about that too. The wealthy will opt out. They will fulfill their needs for an education through the market. Private schools. And I'm not talking as much about Catholic schools. Catholic schools are kind of an interesting alternative that serve a small fraction of the population, but they're privately funded. So equity lens, yes, yeah, but let's think a lot more deeply about what that means. We've tested it out with sidewalks. I think, yes, we passed the test. We proved we need it, proved it can work. Then let's take it to the next step.
Just two questions, make sure I'm not muted. Two questions, just following up on that. I guess, when you look at the discussions now about workforce development and training, do you view that as an appropriate investment in people that could be a remedy to these long-term inequities and inequalities? I mean, I realize, and I say that I realize that there are a lot of details that have to be shared with the public, but just the concept as we know it of shifting sales tax dollars into education and retraining for adults.
Yep. Again, it's it's a community need, and I absolutely believe in it. The Alamo Promise, I think, was probably one of the best and greatest things that the city's done in a long time. Pre-K for SA as well, and it is recognizing that the wealth and health of our entire city is a community responsibility, and these are equity issues, because our inner city schools, where like Alamo Promises is really good, it kind of began, and where it will be so strong. Some of those schools have not been able to keep up for all of these different funding reasons, for real estate reasons, for wealth reasons, and for stuff at the state that's gone on. So those are forms of equity. Workforce and so Workforce Solutions, Alamo, who's receiving a lot of the money, and will be part of the new tax, if it passes, that the new tax kind of agreement, and providing new workforce development, workforce training is phenomenal. They're just doing great work.
I think the other follow-up question I had was, as a parent with kids, I know lots of other parents with kids. And so I'm in conversations where parents specifically choose certain school districts just because of their reputation. And I guess, if you kind of game it out, then are we unknowingly participating in this history that you outlined, and then naturally, so like, if you choose, people aren't aware of this history necessarily, and so they just want to send their kid to a good school, right?
Yep.
And then I guess, how do you break through that?
Oh boy. Okay. We're not aware, right? So we do follow. In my case, I was coming from out of town, and I was following realtors. But I also knew that I was being profiled, and I was being pushed into certain neighborhoods, right? So I was able to pick up on that, and a lot of us can pick up on that. I had the luxury, I know that through my position, of trying to figure out what was happening. Most of us don't have that luxury to be able to to kind of do the background work. But we as a community are becoming more and more cognizant of some of this, right? Just through conversations like this one, we're starting to listen to it. Well, we've always listened to one another. And so a lot of this news is out there now. But we do the best thing for our kids. Where this gets much more and more, and actually, we prefer different kinds of housing situations. Some of us prefer a more suburban housing situation, and some of us prefer an inner city housing situation. And this city is grand and great enough to provide both, right? You don't have to hop into an independent suburb in order to live a suburban lifestyle. You can still be part of the city of San Antonio. That's a unique thing. You can't do that where I'm from. It was inner city or it was suburban, and those were very different. Where this is being challenged the most is where people want a hybrid. So people want inner city living and are starting to revalue inner city living, and are starting to see also that this inner city land is actually quite valuable. It's quite valuable because of a lot of what we've done with our inner city. We're trying to bring our inner city back, right? And we're trying to bring it back, not just for tourists, but for us. And it's gorgeous, and it's fun, and it's wonderful, and it's exciting, and it's dense, and you get to see people that you don't know. And that's where the segregation has done us such a disservice, because we never encounter difference. In an inner city, you start to encounter difference if you welcome everyone. Lots of inner cities don't do that. They push the poor to the side, right? And they only welcome the wealthy. We need to watch out for that, because we could do that also. So more and more people are opting to live in the inner city. They want to live. We call this gentrification, right? That they're going to take a house that has deteriorated, that may have turned into a rental property. That's now like they have the means, the financial means, and the financial tools, including some particular kinds of mortgages that are a little tougher to get, that only some people can get. That means that they can buy that old house, invest in it, fix it up, bring its value back, and live in this wonderful old neighborhood with big trees. But they don't like the school, right? And that's where the charters are starting to really take off. But they're doing it kind of at the cost to a lot of our old neighborhood schools. So our neighborhood schools are losing their student body, the number of students in them. They're losing some diversity through that they could have, that they don't. I don't believe in this income mixing model that says if I put wealthy kids in the same classroom as lower income kids, everybody, that's been shown not to work. It does work in terms of some political capital and things, but as far as like this fusion osmosis of knowledge, no, that's ridiculous. But what they do lose is in the number of kids, right? And then they start to lose teachers, and then it puts a lot more burden on the schools. I wish that as some of these families started to move back in, and they do value our housing and the beauty of our inner city, that they'll also realize that they're part of a neighborhood and part of a community, and figure out how do I believe and support my neighborhood schools, send my kids there, parent my kids really well, you know, be parent mom, whatever, right? So that all of us are part of this whole movement, you know, that we don't just pick and choose. Like, yeah, I want the good house, but I want the school over there. And because I'm kind of connected, I can do it. I have my own car, I'm flexible, I want, well, when I get to work, I can do that when other people can't. So these are, you know, there's some capital, what we call capital there, and who can take advantage of some of those choices and who can't. It's segregating us at a new level.
Christine, and this is continuing this thread of conversation that Josh started. You've mentioned a couple of times the racialization of wealth,
yeah,
and property, and you mentioned redlining. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that direct connection of redlining,
yeah,
the New Deal?
This is so interesting. Redlining is quite in vogue these days to talk about, right? But it's actually more, I think it's more interesting than we allow it to be, all right? Because we're all aghast when we see redlining maps. So just like 30-second back up on this for those who aren't familiar with redlining. Redlining was a tool that was devised by the federal government at the very beginning, the Roosevelt administration, trying to figure out how to pull us out of the Great Depression, knowing that construction is one of the most labor-intensive industries in the world. Any construction site looks like an anthill. There's so many people on it, and we're beginning to mechanize it, but not back then. That was part of it. He wanted to get construction industries rolling. There wasn't enough housing because housing had shut down. Construction had shut down during the Great Depression and during the war because of the wartime economy, right? No housing's being built. He's got soldiers returning by the end of the 30s. So now we're in the mid to end of the 30s, and he's going to have soldiers returning. But the biggest thing about this is the banks had quit lending. So we had no credit. We had no credit in the United States economy. The banks had quit lending. And he says to the banks, how will you begin lending again? Right? And this is the Roosevelt administration. How will you begin lending? And the banks say to him, are you nuts? Nobody has a job. Everybody's in foreclosure. We don't need that on all of those houses on our inventories. Why would we lend? And Roosevelt goes, okay, I understand. Well, what if I do this? What if I, as the United States government, guarantee those loans? You make the loan, I'll guarantee it, right? I'll back it up. That family forecloses, then the United States government will step in with insurance, right? And back up that loan. Mortgage insurance, Federal Housing Administration mortgages, an FHA mortgage. I've had two, right? Most of us, our first home is an FHA mortgage because it's a really low down payment, then spread over 30 years, but you pay mortgage insurance every month. You pay mortgage insurance because if you foreclose, the United States government will step in, right? So, but the banks are going, cool, we love that new tool, yes, but some of these areas are just too risky. We're still risk averse, we're not doing that. And they said, we'll do it in new areas where there's new development, in the new suburban development, we're good, right? And that's all of our neighborhoods built in the really 1940s and on in San Antonio. That's between the loops, right? 410 and 1604. That's all of that. But the bank said, what about those inner city neighborhoods? Some of those are deteriorating. And so they said, so the federal government goes, okay, we'll tell you where it's safe to lend and where it's not safe to lend. And they sent local realtors and local appraisers into every single neighborhood in every single city in the United States. And they judged the risk of those neighborhoods. And the risk was based on two things: the quality of the housing stock and the demographics of the neighbors, of the people who lived there. If you had a good housing stock, right, Monte Vista, and you had a white demographic, that was coded green or coded blue, right? And that was a signal to the banks who were using these maps. I have the map right over here if you want to see it. I went to the archives to scan it. It was a code to the banks that you could lend in this area. It was very low risk, and you could lend at really favorable interest rates. Okay, green and blue. Yellow on the maps, which most of our city was yellow, was a housing stock that was beginning to deteriorate, and the threat of a non-white population. All right, a lot of our south side was coded yellow, and our yellow neighborhoods had been built in the 1920s, less in the 1930s. They were built with small working class housing. Think of the South Side, right? And they were heavily deed restricted for whites. So they were very much built for a white working class population. And think about the industry on the South Side, right? So this was Kelly, this was Lackland, this was Brooks. That's who that was built for. But because of the changing times, in a larger and larger immigrant and Mexican American population, those neighborhoods which were affordable were beginning to see a non-white population move in. Redlining, right? The neighborhoods that were redlined were supposed to be, by definition, a housing stock that was deteriorating and a non-white population. Our west side was redlined, right? Interestingly, Dignity Hill, our first elite suburb with some of the most beautiful housing in the city, is also redlined, right? Completely. Why? Gorgeous housing stock, right? It had servants' quarters in the back and on the edges. I think what's going on here is more so on the edges. This is gone now, but you can see it through old historic maps that along the railroads, and the railroad on the east side goes east-west right along 35, and then it does come down and go north-south along I-37, right? Some of that's been a little bit cut up, but it's still there. Along those railroads was all little tiny bungalow housing for African Americans, all of it. You can see it in the old census, that you can see the race of all the old houses. Some of that's still there. It's teeny tiny. Some of it's heavily deteriorated. Some of it's even abandoned, but some of it somebody hung on to, and it's really humble, but it's got beautiful gardens. Somebody's still living there and hung on to it. That whole area was redlined, probably because of the demographic shift, not because of the housing. What's the impact today? Is scattered. It's completely scattered. We want to say, oh, redlining, deterioration. Oh my God, weren't those people very, very bad? And yes, those people are very, very bad. But the impact is so much more interesting. On the west side, total divested neighborhoods, okay? Until recently, these areas were divested, then they were demolished with urban renewal, right? And now we're using the divestment of the mid-century as an excuse for demolition. So we're continuing the same process, okay? West Side is extremely vulnerable, partly because of redlining and urban renewal, but even more deeply because of the way it was built in the first place. East Side, Dignity Hill, redlined, allowed to deteriorate for 50, 60 years because of the redlining, because it was really difficult to get money. You erase those laws in 1968 with the Fair Housing Act. All of a sudden, what gets exposed? Fantastic housing. It was heavily racially restricted, whites only. So it was wealthy housing, allowed to deteriorate, but built well because it was built for whites and it was built for middle and upper class whites. Now gentrified because we now reintroduce these tools that are really only available to an elite, particular kinds of mortgages that allow you to fix up a house. Again, this is racialized wealth. You know, Dignity Hill is extremely gentrified, right? It's actually a parallel universe because you do have some of the original, some of the older inhabitants also usually in rentals or in an inherited house, but that gentrification layer, and the two are like this, the two don't really mix. So yes, redlining, but it's had actually a much more intricate and interesting impact than most conversations kind of touch on.
Do you you mentioned you scanned the map. You wanna show us the map? Is that possible? Is it?
Yeah, let's see. It's in this pile. It's in a deep pile.
That's okay. You don't have to. You don't have to scrounge through piles and whatnot. I am curious though. How does the redlining map line up with school district boundaries as we know them? I guess in the 18 school districts that we have.
Okay. What you got to remember is that redlining. Shoot, I would love to show you a map of it. I'm going to try to do this as I talk. No, can't. Redlining was for the old city, okay? And so the redlining map is the 6 by 6 mile square of the old city of San Antonio. That was what Hildebrand to just about New Braunfels to 24th Street to Division on the south side. So that's the only area that was redlined, and that was all SAISD. And we had green, blue, yellow, and red in there, okay? SAISD was considered a wealthy district because it had all that green property, the green and the blue. So Monte Vista was green lined, Beacon Hill, Alta Vista, they were all blue. Those were wealthy neighborhoods at that time. They deteriorated later with white flight. Where the redlining really comes in is over with Edgewood and with Alamo Heights. Alamo Heights was a city by the time redlining comes in, because Alamo Heights is actually quite old. Alamo Heights is completely coated green and then becomes a school district, right? And then says to SAISD, no, like we've got really valuable property. We're green line, credit is flowing, we are doing well. No, we're not going to consolidate with you who have some of that other stuff in you. Edgewood though is redlined, right? And Edgewood couldn't get credit, is already a property poor, meaning that the property's not worth a lot. Families are non-white and racialized, right? The wealth is racialized. They're not able, they work as harder than anybody else in not as well-paying jobs, but their houses don't build equity, right? So through the generations, even if you started off in a white area with a house that was small and not worth a lot, it built equity through the years. In these other areas, they haven't. And that's also something you can show pretty easily statistically. That's where the redlining comes in with the school districts. So SAISD is kind of the question there. And it is more a product of white flight than it is of redlining, right? White flight happens in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The legislation for it is in the 50s. The movement is in the 60s and the 70s. And it has a lot to do with economic development in the city. So we do have some vestiges of redlining in our school districts. Even more so, it's a white flight. Harlandale was a white school district. Harlandale is a great example of these neighborhoods that were built. Harlandale was highly restricted for white working class. The houses were supposed to be worth about $2,000 in the 1920s, 1930s. You have to go through one of those calculators to see what that is now. But it was working class, but it's heavily restricted against African Americans and Mexican Americans. So it was white working class. You saw white flight in the with school desegregation, and a lot of families trace roots. North Side families still trace roots to Harlandale. It's only a generation off, right? And grandma still lives in Harlandale, and they now live in Northeast or North Side.
More questions from the group? I have more questions, but I'm going to back off for a minute.
Trying to think of
So can you address what the having the Mexican school and the colored schools in the districts did to education, and how that limited the education
Yeah.
of a lot of these students because they were in high schools or middle schools.
Yeah, I can. And I don't want to romanticize, okay? The three are very different, okay? So to speak about, and I would love, I mean, did you grow up here?
No.
Okay. You hear from people who grew up here about the Mexican schools and the issue with language and Spanish and the kind of the code switching that children had to do between being at home on the weekend and speaking only Spanish and coming to school during the day and speaking only English, and what it must have been like, right? For children who still are traumatized by the stories of the code switching and the language switching that they had to go through. And yes, they're not as well documented, honestly, but there were Mexican-American schools within SAISD, right? So children were segregated. That story is more complicated because a lot of the Mexican-American population, especially those that had not come with the revolution, that had been here for quite a long time, were part of the elite and were considered Caucasian, ethnically Mexican, but still racially white. And then there's court cases, I can't remember which one, that says no, Mexican ethnicity is racially white. So it's much more fluid type of identity at that point. In the African-American communities, that was a much more clear line. And on the East Side, you had the African-American elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools. Really, what today is the Young Men's Leadership Academy, was the Phyllis Wheatley Middle School, was the Black High School. What today is Ella Austin Community Center, was the Ralph Waldo Emerson White High School. Two high schools within 1.5 miles of one another, right? So many elementary schools, you're practically tripping over them on the East Side, especially because of the duplication in services between white and black. Great authors, bell hooks amongst them, but Maya Angelou as well, speak of going to African-American colored schools, knowing their teachers, knowing the business people that lived in the community, very much being part of community as they grew up, and being then thrown into desegregated schools and struggling with their identity. So some of those neighborhood schools were functioning. They functioned and they were functioning highly. And you hear stories from people who are a product of it. Desegregation, caused these schools, especially on the east side of San Antonio, to really suffer, because a lot of the resources were then shifted over to other areas. Thomas Jefferson High School was the flagship at the time. It was white, had the most beautiful architecture of some of the schools in the country, and the highest resources. So some of this, again, the stories that you hear I think they're sometimes more interesting than we allow them to be. And it really is sometimes a celebration much more of the neighborhood and of the community, and how growing up in some of these communities was, because it was so community oriented. The school was community oriented, the businesses are community oriented, especially the stories from the East Side. Carrie, I bet you have a lot to add to that, because you've studied the East Side for so long.
No, but I'm just shaking nodding my head because, being raised and living on the East Side, I'm familiar with those stories and how it was when you had the all black schools and you had the black teachers and the black principals who lived in the same neighborhood, went to your church.
Yeah.
I grew up right at the tail end of that. And so my 1 year in public school, I have some familiarity with that, but you're so right about how the community changed with desegregation, which was a good thing, but it's one of the things that we lost.
No, and it's and that's why it gets complicated. And actually, from a white perspective, it's hard to talk about. but we desegregated, but we didn't redistribute resources, right? If anything, we took resources out, right? So we divested, we desegregated, but we divested. What we needed to do was desegregate and then invest.
Exactly.
Right. And now we claim to be doing some of that, but in the process, we're also displacing. Right. And that's the fear right now, is that because we didn't do it right in the 60s and the 70s, right? We desegregated and we divested. Now we're trying to continue to integrate. But in the process, we're displacing, because that property is now valuable, and we're pushing people out, So I just wish we could slow it down.
Yeah.
I wish we weren't so property dependent for all, the city, the city budget is completely property dependent. It's not based on what we make, right? It's not based on, that we make Toyota Tundras in this city. It's based on how much our property is worth. So if we can push our property values up, we're a wealthier city. How do we do that? We get rid of the little houses and we build big ones. You see that everywhere. We're taking out affordable housing and we're building like 3 stories up, $250,000 housing. We just got rid of some more of it. It's a foundational fault, right? It's not unique to here. It's constitutional that we protect property, that everything is based on property. And we got to figure out a way. And we can't just leave it to national leaders or state leaders. We love this city too much. We have to figure out a way to protect our inner city neighborhoods, our east side neighborhoods, right? And that little humble housing that is a beautiful starter housing. And then, your kids grew up and you want a bigger house, fine. Well, let's not get rid of all of it. Nope. West Side, the West Side's so vulnerable. It's so vulnerable because it's within walking distance. It's within walking distance of our beautiful downtown. It's within walking distance of our great UTSA, our great public university. And it's little tiny lots with deteriorated housing in a lot of places that people can, I'll take 2, right? I'll pick up a couple of them and here's cash, right? You see the signs around, cash for housing, ugly house, cash. I'll pay your moving expenses. I'll pay your closing costs. Well, guess what? Yeah, they're not gonna, they're looking to take it out and rebuild. And the city, because of the financial crisis right now, is almost has to say yes, because they need the property values. They need our property values to go up because we lost our tourism. We're losing our restaurants, right? We're losing a lot of our sales taxes. The state's not coming in. The feds aren't coming in. The only thing we have is property. So yeah, stuff is getting through zoning right now. Duh. Sorry.
I'm just curious, we're in a moment where students are doing virtual learning, or will renew virtual learning, I guess, in a few weeks. And we saw a lot of stories about families that didn't have internet access or don't have computers. And my daughter's school has already started, and that school, just her school has loaned out 200 laptops.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, do you view the digital divide that's so obvious in San Antonio, do you view that as an extension of this kind of history and education you've taken us through?
Totally. The history of property,
Yeah.
right? The history of property, education piles on top of that.
Yes, that's a good clarification.
So, because digital right now is still a market good, right? It has not been absorbed by, telephone is quasi-public, right? Telephone, we have like the old landlines, we're quasi-public. And I don't understand the full story of it. But digital is still completely in the private sector. So digital coverage is really, really strong in wealthy neighborhoods. Go to the east side and your coverage is patchy, right? Because it's market oriented. Now, as we realize as a society how important digital coverage is, there's more and more pressure on the private providers to get it into poorer parts of town and into rural areas. Rural areas are still sunk. So how are we making up for that until we as a society agree that this has got to be a public good, that it is a good that is guaranteed to everybody, like the mail service, right? In the old telephone bills, there was a little tiny tax, and I can't remember, it was the FCC tax, that it was used to bring telephone lines to rural areas. We need the same thing in internet and in digital access. Right now it's private. The local branch, I think it might be through Lift Fund, through the Asset Funders Network, through the Federal Reserve. I mean, for some reason, the Federal Reserve has been part of this. The Dallas branch has been working hard on the digital divide in San Antonio and trying to build a network on the west side around the poorest neighborhoods of intense digital internet access through wireless, right? And it's not just little hotspots. It's actually like major, like bringing it in and pouring it back out. So it would be like through optic cable and then pouring it out through wireless and giving families free access to that wireless. That's what it looks like when we start to see what now is a private good become a public good, because we know for health and safety reasons that it should be a public good, meaning that we all pay and we all benefit, right? Like roads, like street lights, all of that kind of stuff, like old-fashioned TV. There is a little bit of a private investment, but then it's free. So there's an experiment out there right now that is exciting, that can be duplicated and that can be taken to scale with investment. The thing is, who's going to invest? If this is just, if it's just a one-time, you know, the problem is when we start to depend too much on grants for these kinds of investments. Now that's a one-time capital expense that hopefully would be lasting. But when we start to peg things like salaries and services and things like that to grants don't last. We need to institutionalize this stuff, and somehow all of us carry the burden of it. Go back again, thinking about Alamo Promise. If it's just grant focused, it's not going to last. If it's like kind of folded into the tax or whatever we pay to the Alamo Community College District through our property taxes, it will last because it's spread over the entire population, right? And then it's focused in on who needs it. Same thing with internet. And that's what we're finding in this city, is that we have a population that can't afford it. Those kids are going to fall behind. And it is, and social services, just to be purely economic and really, really pragmatic, social services are very expensive. When you have a huge population like that, again, thinking about the photo that you started the conversation with, that's dependent on the public to pay, and they're not paying in, that's really expensive. We need to raise these kids up so that they're contributing, right? Contributing to the larger good and not just completely dependent.
I think our hour is up. I have more questions, but I'll save them for another time. I don't know about the rest of the gang. You know, we have some viewers out there, I'm sure. So just anyone who's watching, thanks for watching us and listening to our conversation. And of course, we'll welcome your emails and thoughts and feedback. And Dr. Drennon, thank you for joining with us.
This was awesome. This was amazing. I've read the three of you for years, and this has been a really fantastic conversation.
It was a pleasure.
I'll probably be in touch because I have some really specific questions about some of the details in your studies, and so
Anytime.
I'll be in touch next week.
Easy to find.